There is a growing rift between what the broader public thinks about the United States' future in NATO and what those within the organization itself believe. Let me give you some numbers to back this up. In an incredibly rigorous and scientific poll, I asked Lines on Maps enthusiasts whether the United States withdrawing is a serious concern. More than 26,000 of you voted, and 63% of you said yes. The problem is, I could not find a single person at NATO who shared the same sentiment. Not one. There were various caveats that the United States might be less active if Europe did not raise its military contributions, and what things might look like short of a US withdrawal. But in terms of an actual withdrawal, no one. I was worried that you might not believe that such a discrepancy between the public and elites exists. So I personally asked Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, whether the United States is going to withdraw. He said, "It won't happen." And before you think I was speaking metaphorically when I said that I asked him, no, I literally asked him. About 60% of my audience believes that a US withdrawal from NATO is a serious concern. What would you say to them?
Well, it won't happen because...
Thanks for that, Secretary General. We will get back to you later. Now, is it possible that NATO is wrong and the public consensus is right? Sure. Time will tell. It is worth noting that Rutte's comments came before the Oval Office meltdown involving Trump, Vance, and Zelensky. But the lesson here is not that my public polls may sometimes actually be convoluted prefaces to questions that I pose to world leaders, though I guess you need to be concerned about that from now on. Instead, the lesson is that NATO is intentionally designed to give the United States plenty of incentive to stay in the organization, because that has been a central objective of NATO all along. So even if you are confident in your own assessment of the situation, it is still worth understanding why NATO, as an organization, is not as concerned. Thus, we will start today with a brief overview of how NATO's original purpose ties into today's problem. Then we will look at 4 arguments against an American departure from NATO: its political benefits to Washington, its military benefits as well, of which there are a ton that each deserve their own time, the literal problem of physically trying to leave the organization, and finally, the difficulty of doing so from an American domestic legal perspective. And if you believe that this is a sign of things to come, then think about these points as a forewarning for the mess that is about to transpire. Let's begin with understanding NATO's core mission. It is easy to just open up the North Atlantic Treaty, point to Article 5's collective security provision, and call it a day. But if only something like this were so simple. If we want to understand what really goes on behind the scenes, we need to travel back in time. Now, NATO has had many secretaries general over the decades, but the key to our story for today is the original, the United Kingdom's Lord Ismay. He is best known for his philosophy that NATO's key missions were to 1. Keep the Soviet Union out, 2. Keep the Americans in, and 3. Keep the Germans down. Not only did the man keep his tie on brand, he was also prescient. Regarding the first point, what is old is new again. Regarding the third point, well, I guess what is old might be new again soon enough. As for the second point, not only is what is old new again, it is also generating our long discussion for today. You see, Ismay served as Winston Churchill's chief military assistant during World War II, and he took a central lesson from that conflict. At the time, Ismay was worried that the United States would pull a repeat of World War I and abandon the continent following the termination of hostilities. Then, once World War III would begin, just like it did with World War II, the United States would take its sweet time intervening. Although a lot has changed since the days of Lord Ismay, the incentives for the United States to remain in NATO are still present. And if we are really careful about what has happened in the news over the last couple of weeks, we will see the consequences of NATO's structuring in American rhetoric. You probably heard a ton about Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth's trip to NATO headquarters on February 13th. He was flying to Brussels to take part in NATO's annual Defense Ministers Summit, which gave Hegseth the opportunity to meet his 31 counterparts. It seemed that he came out throwing daggers. The United States will no longer tolerate an imbalanced relationship, which encourages dependency. If troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine, they should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5. European allies must lead from the front. There will not be U.S. troops deployed to Ukraine. We're here today to directly and unambiguously express that stark strategic realities prevent the United States from being primarily focused on the security of Europe. Perhaps it is not surprising that the headlines that followed looked like these. However, the public discourse that followed basically made it seem like the United States was about to wholly abandon the continent, which is not the full story. In the same speech as the rest of those quotes, Hegseth also stated, unambiguously, that the United States remains committed to the NATO alliance and to the defense partnership with Europe. Full stop. And he was saying full stop there. It was not me adding it. At the meeting itself, at least for the public-facing parts, he was all smiles as he introduced himself to the other ministers. The content of the meeting reflected that, perhaps best described as a frank conversation that looked for a path forward while ripping off a bandage. And his point was not about abandoning Europe. It was a continuation of Trump's long-running policy that the United States has to pivot to China, one way or the other. Yes, one might ask whether now is the right time for such a hard pivot. Certainly, that is the conversation in Kyiv at the moment. Heck, it is controversial within Republican spheres. Elbridge Colby, the main architect behind the 2018 National Defense Strategy that began the pivot, and now currently Trump's nominee for DoD Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, had his nomination held up by Tom Cotton because Cotton thinks that Colby's preoccupation with China makes him too soft on Iran. But the argument from this sector of the national security community, which extends well past the Trump administration, is not that the United States should abandon Europe. Rather, the United States should focus on Asia, because it has a comparative advantage in naval power projection. And as long as Europe cares about, say, semiconductor manufacturing, then the continent should also care about the Indo-Pacific. Meanwhile, Europe should focus on the border with Russia, because it has a comparative advantage in its geographic positioning. And Europe can still fall back to Washington on parts of continental defense, better suited for American forces. And while a smaller American contribution on the continent might not be ideal for Europe, any European country entangled in the global economic marketplace benefits from more deterrent power in the Pacific. It is a trade-off. Indeed, the more hawkish European leaders recognize that trade-off, and how the United States ultimately has to divide its attention between the two priorities. That is why you have Mark Rutte saying regarding a potential American abandonment that,
well, it won't happen because NATO is there not only to keep Europe safe, but also to keep the US safe. It is an alliance which has a strong history, but also a very strong future to make sure that we keep the whole of the alliance safe, 1 billion people. The US is over 50% of NATO economy. What the US wants us to do in the rest of NATO is to spend more, and the US is totally right there, because why would they spend more than the rest? But that is a debate we are having internally. But there is no question about the endurance down the generations of NATO.
Now, longtime viewers of this channel might be thinking to themselves, hey, shouldn't we not be listening to what leaders say, but rather watching what they do? And fair point. But it is worth emphasizing that these two leaders are saying the same things. even if it often seems like the media discussion is that they are at each other's throats. And sure, Rutte does not speak for Europe, but he does speak for the organization. Beyond that, there are 3 other things to think through here. One is that it is not just Rutte saying this, nor is it just Hegseth. It is also literally every single one of the dozens of people that I spoke to at headquarters, both on and off the record. I will give you a surprisingly topical tour of the building in a moment. But for now, one interesting factoid is that the entire thing is made out of glass. The architect did it as a nod to the organization's transparency. And if I can let you in on a dirty little secret, it is that democracies are, well, not very good at keeping secrets. If NATO really was worried about an American withdrawal, then we would be hearing about it. Perhaps not from Rutte, but via leaks from any number of frustrated European delegates and staff members. We do not have that, though. Instead, we have some heavy headlines that draw on only half of Hegseth's comments, and plenty of documentation of Europe's frustration with the Trump administration's candor, which is worth keeping an eye on. Second is working through the contingencies. NATO is not spending time trying to plan out what the organization looks like without US membership. To be clear, if the United States withdraws, Europe's solution does not become the formation of a new organization. NATO still exists, and member states are still legally bound to it. The other 30 European countries, plus Canada, are not going to demolish the headquarters in Brussels and spend another 1.1 billion euros on a new Canada-Europe Treaty Organization building. Friendly reminder that the last time that there was an alliance pronounced CETO, it did not turn out so well. That said, a US-less NATO would require significant reshuffling of the organization's structure. And if it were something that seemed plausible to NATO, they would be exerting significant effort to develop contingency plans. Again, if that were happening, we would be hearing significant leaks about it. However, we are not hearing such leaks, and therefore, in yet another victory for modus tollens, NATO is genuinely not worried about it. Now, to be clear, European leaders are convening a ton of meetings to coordinate continental security, and a bunch of enterprising politicians are taking a more extreme stance, which is certainly good if you want to establish a brand. What is most interesting about these comments to me is that they tend to come from the more hawkish political leaders, those who naturally want to raise defense spending, and who find this to be a convenient political message to get their way. But the actual state-level planning is more geared toward how Europe can take over the primary role of European security, especially as it relates to the Ukraine situation. It is not about living in a post-NATO world, where the United States renders Article 5 irrelevant. Again, we will have to see how the Oval Office meltdown changes this. The initial reaction, and what is fast becoming a universal reaction to anything that Trump does, has been a push to increase European defense spending, with the traditional hawks once more being the loudest about it. One thing worth putting into context here is to re-emphasize that the Trump administration views the Ukraine war as an impediment to its China pivot. The president just wants to say goodbye to the conflict, which, for better or worse, helps explain his apparent indifference regarding the terms that they settle on. Now, the White House's position seems to understate the fact that when the war ends, the security situation will not suddenly vanish. Special Envoy to Ukraine Keith Kellogg does fully grasp this, and it is part of his publicly available peace plan. But that seems to get buried in the rest of the discussion. In any case, all of that is distinct from the United States cooperating with Europe under Article 5, a topic that we will get to later. For now, it is worth pointing out that the other 2 White House summits earlier in the week were perfectly normal and cordial. That was true both when Trump was elated to receive an invitation from the King for a state visit, but also when Macron pushed back against Trump in their public Oval Office comments. Trump understands that he is in a stronger bargaining position vis-a-vis Ukraine, and he does not really care about the diplomatic optics of flexing it. However, he also realizes that the United States still needs Europe's help in Europe, so he is more cautious on that front. To draw a very rough analogy, remember when the Bush administration was trying to convince European allies that an Iraq war would be a good idea? Well, many of them did not go along with it. The United States instead built a coalition of the willing to fight the war. It was not a signal of the end of cross-Atlantic relations, though it did result in some silly renamings of food items. French or freedom fries, the alliance persisted all the same. Yes, today's rift is worse than that spell. And yes, it is possible that NATO is looking at this incorrectly, and will regret its confidence in the United States remaining a part of the alliance. But we have not yet discussed the third reason why Rutte's message has inherent credibility. That, of course, is everything that Lord Ismay was talking about. Look, we are in a world where Trump is dancing right past every traditionally accepted norm in international relations. When you plot the ideological spectrum of the United Nations General Assembly, and I mean this literally, the United States and North Korea are on exact opposite poles. But here we are. However, the thing about norms is that they work well when they are generally a good idea, and everyone is naturally predisposed to following them. Yet when someone challenges a norm, it seems at this point that the most common reaction is to shame those individuals for breaking the norm. The trouble with shame is that, "How dare you?" is rarely a compelling argument to those who do not understand the norm or who are actively hostile to it. Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General preceding Mark Rutte, is known for saying that it is good to have friends. And while that may be true, it is not going to convince skeptics. Thus, we need to spend some time covering the nuts and the bolts of the alliance. So, celebrate, because we have a whole second half of the video to concentrate on that, and more. And, like I said before, if NATO is wrong about what the United States will do, let the remainder of this video serve as a forewarning of all of the ugly mess that will soon be forthcoming. That potential contingency aside, let's begin with the political aspects of the situation. To do that properly, we really need to take a tour of NATO headquarters, understand why it is primarily a political institution despite its military branding, and how it functions on a day-to-day basis. Thus, we must fly to Brussels, a relatively central location among the British, French, and German power poles, land at the airport, and then take a 6-kilometer drive down the highway to HQ. Assuming you get through security, that will take you to the main background image for today's video. Actually, it is exactly here on the map, and looking back, you can see how it is a cleverly disguised barrier, designed to prevent a car from trying to speed into the building. And if you look to the left of the image, and to the southern point of the headquarters campus, you will find the set of 32 flagpoles, one for each country, and undoubtedly a source of frustration for the groundskeeper whenever a new country joins the alliance. It is also where the NATO star sculpture sits. Heading inside, NATO's main atrium, or agora as they call it, runs roughly north-south. It is that glass room that we discussed earlier, and so frequently appears in B-roll of the organization. To get in, most leaders will drive through, or more precisely, zigzag around, the previously seen security area. But there is little rest, as right inside the entrance is another set of flags, referred to as the NATO doorstep, where leaders are liable to be peppered with questions from reporters. At least they may take some comfort in knowing that those flags from earlier are also conveniently designed to obscure the view of a sniper that may be in the area. In any case, the vast majority of the building's floor space consists of these 8 wings, conceived of by the architect as fingers of 2 hands coming together to form a shield. Spelled Sierra, Hotel, India, Echo, Lima, Delta. They house each member state's delegation. Countries differ on whether they call their primary official an ambassador or a permanent representative. But the important thing is that these are top-level political missions. Consequently, what goes on inside of these halls is not military planning in the traditional sense. For that, you would have to travel about 86 kilometers southwest to Mons, which is a classified location, and I assure you, not a part of the Minecraft universe. But even then, the military side of NATO is fragmented. Actually, that is part of the lesson here. NATO does not have a military. It has 31 militaries. Sorry, Iceland, I am not going to count your Coast Guard. And they all have slightly different political goals. Or perhaps now, in the case of the Trump administration, a notably different goal. Thus, what NATO headquarters does on a day-to-day basis is sort out the political questions that arise when you are dealing with $40-something trillion in total GDP. This makes the Brussels building unique among institutions that fit within the Western liberal order. Sure, there are other fora that ideologically aligned Western countries take part in, like the United Nations. But this is the place where it is only them. Never mind that they are all in the same halls, rather than strewn around the streets of New York. It is actual face-to-face interaction, not people staring at a screen. Thus, when new political policy among Western countries needs to be developed, it occurs inside of this building. When Russia begins encroaching on European territory, the countermeasures form in this building. Well, not this one, the glass one you just saw. And when a new crisis suddenly upends the world, the first responses are discussed in this building. In fact, the architect had this type of collaboration in mind when designing it. In addition to the main 8 wings occupied by the 32 delegations, there are 4 smaller wings that house NATO's international staff, and this larger space that holds the main North Atlantic Council meeting room, seen here during the 2025 Defense Ministerial Meeting, as well as the location where one might take a family portrait and begin analyzing some lines on pants. Solid job from the Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, but I think Turkey's permanent representative to NATO is winning this year's award. All told, this ends up creating a mini-city of about 3,500 people during working hours. Of course, to support that many people, you need to have some amenities. Notably, these were not built within each wing. Rather, they were centralized in this part of the building, known as the public square. It contains a handful of meeting rooms and some workspaces for the media who have clearance to enter the campus. The press briefing room is in the center, slightly below ground. It has a library, which in the opinion of your not-so-humble narrator, has a fantastic collection of books. There is a barber shop across from the dry cleaners. You have a coffee shop, which allegedly had to get a second espresso machine after the Italian delegation complained that the first one was not good enough. And then there is a large cafeteria to feed everyone throughout the day. After hours, the NATO crew can head north to a second complex, which serves as a recreation center and gym. There is a track and a football field, which perhaps the United States could, in exchange for staying in the alliance, change to a football field. Or you can head inside, get in a match of tennis, or enjoy a potent potable in their lounge area. The point is that the building's design intentionally encourages the delegations to interact with each other. It is difficult to silo oneself off inside of a wing. If you want something, you have to walk to the building center. Rather, the socialization gets the delegations to naturally cross paths and have conversations about the political problems that they jointly face. This was not as important during the Cold War era, when the politics were simpler and limited to counterbalancing the Soviet Union. But after the Soviet Union fell apart, and NATO went through a brief identity crisis, the alliance reemerged as the bastion of democratic priorities. This created a greater political mission for the organization, which is reflected when ground broke on the current headquarters in 2010. And if you think that the Western liberal order extends past NATO member states, you are right. But NATO also has that covered. What you are looking at is the previous NATO headquarters, flags down as the delegations are no longer there. It was built as a temporary space in 1967, and in what is a perfectly normal sense of the word temporary, it remained the headquarters for the following 50 years. Anyway, it is right across the street from the current headquarters, and, for reasons unclear, is bizarrely part of the Google Earth blurfest, despite the crystal clear image just slightly north. You can see that it is much more sprawling, and much harder to get those natural interactions. The upshot is that it is still useful. All of that excess office space now houses the missions for NATO partner countries, Russia excluded since 2021. Those who remain are a shouting distance away, in case there needs to be a broader political discussion. Even in a Trump-reoriented world, where the United States is paying closer attention to China, Washington still needs to politically coordinate with the rest of the Western coalition. That is what NATO offers. And the United States gets this for quite the bargain price. Washington contributes just 15.88% to NATO's budget, exactly the same portion that Germany does. The other main problems lie on the military side of things. Actually, remember that we can divide this logic into 5 parts. Each could probably be a full video in its own right, but let me cover for you the high-level points for now. Let's start with Article 5, the part that you are already most likely familiar with. That is an attack on one is an attack against all clause of the treaty. Pop quiz. How many times has an ally invoked Article 5? Just once, on October 4th, 2001. NATO headquarters has a piece of mangled metal from the World Trade Center to serve as a reminder. Actually, it is directly across from a piece of the Berlin Wall, another reminder of its goal to never have Europe be divided again. While we will wait to see about the division part, at least in regard to deterrence, the alliance has been immensely successful. Indeed, if its goal is to deter attacks on member countries, then one failure over 3/4 of a century is not bad. Right now, it seems that all of the focus on deterrent concerns is directed at Europe, and that makes sense, given that the largest land war on that continent since World War II is ongoing. Nevertheless, it is plausible that the United States will make it 2 Article 5 invocations in a row. Only a few months ago, the mystery of exploding packages was tied to preparations from Russia to attack U.S. airliners. Trump is also ramping up the rhetoric against Mexican cartels, and you can imagine one getting some ideas about a strike on American soil. Then there is China. If the whole point of the Trump pivot is to crack down on China, then that leaves open the possibility of China attacking the United States. As a result, the United States still has a vested interest in protecting the reciprocal nature of Article 5. To wit, the US-led coalition in Afghanistan suffered 3,621 fatalities. 2,461 of them were Americans, meaning that Washington only bore about 2/3 of the losses, despite Europe not being the original target. Almost all of the other fatalities were either incurred by NATO member countries, or countries that would later become NATO members. Note the Swedish flag in the background of this video of the Secretary General's visit from 2016. In the case of many Eastern European countries, they specifically participated as a means to pay it forward to an alliance that they were not yet a part of. Second on the list is exploiting each state's comparative advantage in arms production. Trump is big on savings for the government and efficiency gains, so he ought to like this part. NATO states deliberately leave some portion of their militaries underdeveloped or completely non-existent. Here is a bit of a puzzle for you. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania cover a large portion of the coastline of the Baltic Sea, sometimes now jokingly referred to as the NATO Lake. Well, how many submarines do they have? The answer is 0. None. Perhaps the better question, though, is why? After all, Russia is right there. Given the rhetoric in Washington, you would be liable to think that it is because they are free riding off the others in the alliance. But nope, that is not it. Take a look at NATO's 2022 military expenditures by country as a percentage of GDP. Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia rank 3rd, 6th, and 7th respectively. Finland was not a member of NATO in 2022 and spent 1.9% that year. Thus, it was below what would have been the 2% target threshold as a potential member. However, Finland jumped to 2.5% in 2023. The point is that none of these countries are slouching on defense spending. Something else is going on with the submarines, or lack thereof, in those countries. The trick is that they share land borders with Russia, and the lion's share of them, with Norway only having this tiny bit in the north, and Poland having this weird line with the Kaliningrad exclave. I guess that Lithuania's border does not seem like much, but they view Belarus as Russia in disguise, and figure that the first thing that happens in a land war with Russia is Russia attacking with free rein from there. So maybe the de facto borderline should include all of this too. As a result, it makes sense for them to spend all of their resources fortifying the border. They are the only ones who can, because they are the only ones who live there. Meanwhile, leave it to Sweden, Poland, and Germany, who can cover the water on their behalf. Playing to comparative advantages like that allows members to specialize in what their militaries are better equipped to accomplish. Thus, they can spend more on their stronger categories, save money overall by cutting back on their weaker categories, and yet end up more powerful despite that. To be clear, among all the NATO countries, the United States benefits the least from this specialization strategy. That is because the United States tries to command a full-service military, in large part because Washington wants to leverage offensive capabilities worldwide, which goes far beyond the NATO mandate. Still, the United States is cognizant of the fundamental point. Hegseth's earlier comments also noted that the United States' comparative advantage, and he used that exact phrase, comparative advantage, lies in handling the Indo-Pacific problems. That, in turn, underlies the entire American pivot. And there remain some things that the United States is better off deferring to others, despite its mass. As a quick example, Washington would be better off leaving the development of winter weather strategy to the likes of Norway and Sweden. Moving on, Part 3's effect is much more important for the United States, precisely because Washington wants a large military. Let's discuss economies of scale. Modern weapons systems are enormously expensive to produce. However, there is nuance lost in the absurdity of the price tags given. Take something like the F-16. Reliable figures are hard to come by, but a reasonable estimate is that it cost $70 billion to develop. Nevertheless, the per unit cost to actually produce a single F-16 drops to $80 million. In other words, if I ordered one right now, the US government would have to spend $80 million to produce it. Thus, if you produced 100 F-16s, the total cost is $78 billion, and the true cost per unit is $780 million, distributing the development costs over the total production. In contrast, if you produced 1,000 of them, then the overall cost is $150 billion, and the true cost per unit is $150 million. Not too bad. 10 times the order, only twice the total cost. Welcome to economies of scale. Consequently, the real game in modern military production is lining up as many buyers as you can, from Portugal to Poland. And it is something that disproportionately benefits the larger countries, which have more expansive resources, and therefore can better absorb the capital outlays. Indeed, we have previously discussed how this is a major problem that Russia has started to experience due to the war in Ukraine, and it would become a significant problem if the United States were to ever leave NATO. Sure, it is possible for the United States to sell weapons outside of the NATO framework. But part of the reason that you want to bring everyone under one roof is to facilitate what those production orders look like. Actually, the fourth point on military coordination ties in with this. Any given weapon system has a variety of different branching pathways that its producer can take. Across countries interested in purchasing the system, there will be plenty of common ground. Or bang for the same buck will not have anyone complaining. But opinions will differ on some dimensions. For example, take ammunition. On a per-unit basis, NATO might produce more of that than anything else. Even such a small item requires many design choices. The material, the weight, whether to prioritize stopping power or rate of fire, the list goes on. And just think about how many more pathways there are for more complicated weapons systems. Well, one of the joys of being the alliance leader is having some agenda-setting power over which of those differing options becomes the standard. Withdrawing from NATO removes the United States from that position. Worse, it would mean that the United States would not even have a seat at the table. Let me go deeper into that ammunition example to illustrate the consequences of this. Right after NATO formed, a debate emerged between the United States and the United Kingdom over what type of rifle ammunition would become the standard. It was a hot topic because World War II had gutted Europe's production capacity, and so the Allies needed to pool resources to ensure that any country would have enough in the case of an emergency. Limited European capacity in the time of heightened security concerns. What is old is new again. Two options emerged. The United States preferred the 7.62 by 51 millimeter round, as seen here. Meanwhile, the United Kingdom preferred a 280. Well, the United States went around to each other ally to lobby for its own standard. They all got on board, which forced the United Kingdom's hand. That type of thing would be impossible if the United States left NATO today. And just in case you think that these types of coordination issues come up rarely, nope. NATO literally has an office dedicated to that purpose, and the number of such standardizations within the organization are in the 4 figures. For the final bit under the military benefits category, and this is a more basic point, we need to discuss the geography of force multiplication. Yes, the entire premise behind Europe taking over security affairs regarding Russia and Ukraine is that they are actually in Europe. But NATO is a force multiplier for the United States. Aside from the physical military support, like what we saw in Afghanistan, there is the sheer geographic component. Projecting power across long distances is incredibly difficult. Just think about how many billions of dollars the United States spends on its aircraft carriers in support of that mission. Well, Europe is a continental carrier. The United States has more than 30 bases in Europe, which are critical for operations not only on that continent, but also on Africa and in the Middle East. There is a good chance that you have heard of Ramstein Air Base before, and it is precisely because the United States gets so much use out of it. Think about the crisis mode that the Kremlin went through when the Syrian civil war culminated, and that was over only 2 bases in the country. With Europe and the United States, it is an order of magnitude more important. Anyway, we still have 2 other broader categories to consider, and while I do not think that they are as important of factors, they are nevertheless worth discussing. Let's start with the logistical problems of leaving NATO, as in literally trying to move out. Forget about all of those other bases in Europe. They would be an even worse situation to consider. But trying to leave just Brussels would be a headache on its own. Remember how the headquarters has 8 main wings that house the delegations? Almost all of the allies occupy 1 floor each. Germany, 2 floors. But over here in Wing 7, the United States occupies 5 whole floors. Now, the headquarters are the workspace for thousands of people. With that comes a trade-off. You need the floor clear for delegates to mingle, but you also need to provide services to them. NATO resolves this problem with the third and final building on the campus. All incoming goods, from food to office supplies, enter from the north, then travel underground to seamlessly arrive in the building. While the building has plenty of personal elevators, each wing only has one freight elevator, and therein lies the headaches that come along with moving out. As a point of comparison, it took 5 years to plan the move to the new building, and that was going from right across the street. What you are watching here is just a snapshot of that process, a time-lapse of taking down the flags and readying the star. You can see the new glass building in the background. By contrast, an American NATO departure would not be a 600-meter move. It would be a 6,000-kilometer catastrophe. My sympathies to the people who have to worry about protecting the classified documents. As for actual bases, sure, the United States could negotiate bilaterally to keep those in operation. But if we have learned anything from Brexit, it is that negotiating bilateral agreements is a lot more complicated than having a consistent framework. Then again, Brexit did happen. Finally, we have the legal issues that come with an attempted withdrawal. And I am focusing on the domestic side, because, from NATO's perspective, there is no real issue over in Europe. Article 13 of the North Atlantic Treaty says that, after the treaty has been in force for 20 years, any party may cease to be a party 1 year after. Funny to note, anyone withdrawing must tell the United States to get the process started, so Washington would have to tell itself that it is happening. Where things get more complicated is with internal U.S. politics. Toward the end of the Biden administration, both Congress and the president began worrying that a second Trump term might see a withdrawal attempt. As a result, the National Defense Authorization Act for 2024 included a clause that a U.S. withdrawal would require either a 2/3 confirmation from the Senate or an act of Congress. There are some question marks there, though. The U.S. Constitution states that the Senate must ratify treaties, but that the executive branch negotiates them. Does negotiate include withdrawal? There is no specific language on the subject. Toward the end of the first Trump administration, the White House legal counsel issued an opinion regarding a different treaty that withdrawal is solely the executive's authority. The same logic would apply to a NATO withdrawal. However, White House legal opinions are not law. In contrast, the Congressional Act is a law. But that still is not the end of the story. Trump is certainly capable of challenging the law at the Supreme Court, and a politically right court at that. All of this is to say that any attempt to formally withdraw from NATO will immediately result in a legal challenge. Even if the Supreme Court rejects Trump's bid and breaking a Senate filibuster is impossible, there is a second tier of concern here. Trump may not withdraw, but perhaps he will effectively abandon it. And if the president is not participating, the United States may well not even be there. This is a complex topic that I will have to dedicate a full video to soon. For now, here is the short version. We are indeed seeing some motions that enfeeble Article 5, with Washington skeptical of continuing the Enhanced Forward Presence program to put more U.S. troops in Europe, images from which you have been watching. Well, Article 5's "an attack against one is an attack against all" clause can only be fully successful when opponents believe that it will be enforced. And that kicks the question to how the Kremlin is interpreting all of this. Good luck figuring that out. The closest historical analog to this was France's withdrawal from NATO's Supreme Allied Command, which separated France's military from NATO's military integration. That included expelling NATO military forces from French territory, which came with the side effect of forcing NATO to move from its Paris headquarters, despite its absolutely stunning backdrop, to that allegedly temporary site in Brussels. Still, NATO is not much worried about the prospects of such a middle option. Notably, France withdrew in part because it wanted more independent military latitude, and in part due to complaints that American decision-making was far too dominant within the alliance. Well, I suppose that latter part is telling. If France was upset by US dominance, then perhaps Washington disproportionately benefits from NATO, despite the lion's share of defense spending coming from the Western Atlantic. In other words, Trump need not worry about whatever angle the Dutch or anyone else is trying to operate from. The United States is still the heavy hitter. Anyway, France returned to NATO's Supreme Allied Command in 2009. I suppose that it is a double lesson. A country can withdraw from NATO's command structure because it wants more independence without endangering Article 5, and also that the whole thing is probably not a good idea. To sum up today's massive knowledge drop, there would be a giant mess for all parties involved if the United States pulled out of NATO. The Trump administration's main complaint is that Europe does not contribute enough to collective defense. Europe is aware of this and has been taking active steps to close the gap. So maybe a US withdrawal would be a serious concern if the threat is ignored. But NATO is betting that Europe and the United States will never walk down that road. Well, that is it for me today. See you next time. Wait, you thought that this was going to end without a discussion of two amazing books? Well, to borrow a phrase,
well, it won't happen.
Indeed, here the books are in all of their glory. Check the video description for more information about them. You can also watch my Q&A video about the Oval Office meltdown if you want to hear more about how it interconnects with NATO's position. And if you enjoyed today's video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.